Welcome to another pharmaphorum podcast. In this episode, I have an insightful conversation with Michael Kyle, Chief Medical Officer at Currax Pharmaceuticals, about how obesity has come to be a focal area of research and drug development, but that not every type of obesity is the same, and other interventions have their place as well. From the potential of evolved hypertension treatments to fundamental specific training in obesity as a medical disease area and the criticality of lifestyle and behaviour change going hand in hand with any prescription option, Michael provides his learnings on this area and pushes for a greater understanding of patient needs as much as societal needs. Tune in, send in your comments if you'd like to share any, and as ever, thank you for listening. This is web editor Nicole Raleigh, and today I have with me Michael Kyle, Chief Medical Officer at Currax Pharmaceuticals, a company working to advance a greater understanding of how to effectively treat obesity. According to the World Health Organization, there are more than 1 billion people worldwide who are considered obese. Obesity in children and adults leads to an increase in risk of cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, certain cancers, and many other conditions. And the estimated cost of obesity to the healthcare system in the US alone is between $147 billion and nearly $210 billion per year in medical expenses. Indeed, obesity afflicts more than 40% of adults in the United States. It's not a singular disease either, but of different types, each with different causes. So the question Michael and I will be circling around in today's conversation is, why are doctors currently mostly offering just one type of treatments, GLP-1s, which also happen to be the most expensive? Before we sink our teeth into that, though, Michael, perhaps you could tell listeners a little bit more about your journey to doing what you do today, the path and the passions that led you to your work with Currax.
Yes, well, thank you, Nicole. Thank you for having me on to discuss really a critical topic of obesity. My journey started approximately 30 plus years ago. I'm a physician by training. I was a classic GP or primary care physician in the United States and practiced for about 12 years before switching over into research. During the time of my practice, I realized that around 70% of my patients were overweight, living with obesity, or smokers, or a combination thereof. And during that time of my practice, there were not a lot of options to treat obesity. And in fact, obesity was not considered a disease. It was considered a lifestyle choice or a weakness of character. If the person would just push themselves away from the table, get up and move more, that would solve their problem. When I left clinical practice and started doing clinical research, I had an opportunity to work across several different types of therapeutic areas and obesity medications. And one in particular was naltrexone and bupropion, or what we now know as Contrave or Mycimba. And I conducted several research projects on that for the originator company. After leaving research with the CRO, I joined large pharma and worked there for approximately 10 years or so before getting an opportunity to come back and work for Currax and actually reuniting with Contrave again. It's a product that has been on the market since 2014, 2015 in the US, and 2015, 16 in Europe. So that's my journey. And so now I'm back for the last 2 years working on the treatment of obesity and ensuring that patients and healthcare providers have a clear understanding and access to all the different treatment options that are available.
Thank you for that, Michael. So we're going to tunnel into those treatments available and the access to them a bit more. But a little bit of a precursor preamble to the setting to provide listeners with a sort of broader concept of the field at the moment. I mean, in 2024, pharmaphorum has been reporting on obesity and on GLP-1s with an increasing frequency. GLP-1s are also known as glucagon-like peptide 1 receptor agonists, and they've been on the market for almost 20 years. And the medication has shown efficacy in stabilizing blood glucose levels and exhibited laudatory weight loss results. And the pharma industry is expected to reap sales of $60 billion in 10 years' time within the obesity treatment segment, and rival companies are rushing to bring their own treatments through the pipeline and to market. Just in January, Novo Nordisk reported that sales of Ozempic had risen 60% to $14 billion in 2023, while its Wegovy rocketed more than 400% to $4.5 billion, driven by huge demand that it has been struggling to meet. So it's fair to say that GLP-1s at the moment are veritably rivaling AI as a buzzword. Only last month, again, Novo Nordisk's Ozempic showed efficacy in yet another indication, achieving 24% reduction in kidney disease-related events in people with type 2 diabetes and chronic kidney disease in the FLOW trial. And in the same month, its Wegovy was given a first-in-class approval by the FDA to reduce the risk of serious cardiovascular conditions in people who are overweight or obese. Following that, Medicare loosened restrictions on the reimbursement of obesity drugs. And only today, it was announced, as published in the New England Journal of Medicine, that a small study of Sanofi's lixisenatide, a GLP-1, used for diabetes, suggested that it could slow down the progression of Parkinson's disease, having shown neuroprotective properties in a mouse model of the disease. Then the investment bank, UBS, recently reported from wave one of its Evidence Lab survey that it estimates global GLP-1 model forecasts will see 40 million people or so on the product by 2029, with 44% of those in the US alone. That translates into roughly $126 billion in sales by 2029. It also mentioned that getting access to a GLP-1 prescription in the US is relatively easy for both diabetics and non-diabetics. So there's a big buzz, as I say, around these products. Fundamentally, though, Michael, what are the different types of obesity that exist and the treatments that work best with each of them? Surely there isn't a one-size-fits-all method for obesity.
Sure, and I think that's a great question. It is fundamental to understand as we talk about the different treatment options for obesity. Obesity is very, very complex, and it's a chronic progressive disease. It's defined as the excess accumulation of fat, and it leads to adipose tissue dysfunction, issues regarding triglyceride storage, inflammatory cytokines being released, and insulin resistance. And it's really a result of an imbalance of energy intake versus energy expenditure. But in order to treat obesity correctly, you have to understand the underlying cause. And as we know over the last 15 years, and driven much by recently by the other companies such as Novo Nordisk and Lilly, the understanding of obesity has changed. It's actually, since 2012, been defined as a disease and classified as a disease. It's no longer, as I said earlier, simply a choice or a character weakness. But there are many factors that lead to obesity. Obviously, our genetic makeup is a tremendous component, and it predisposes us, or many of us, to obesity. But there are environmental factors, socioeconomic factors, where we live, the access to healthcare, the access to high-quality diets, whether or not we can go out and exercise. Do we live in a safe environment? All of those environmental factors can impact our genetic makeup. And when you combine the two, when you see the impact of the environment on genetic makeup, you start to understand that there are different phenotypes of obesity. And Dr. Acosta at the Mayo Clinic has done a tremendous amount of work looking at phenotypes and trying to identify, if you determine a certain type or a certain phenotype and then use medications with certain mechanisms of action, that the resulting treatment is more effective. And so, he uses, for example, hungry gut, hungry brain, slow burn, and emotional eater. And someone who has a hungry gut, where the stomach empties the food contents quickly, a GLP-1 may be the right choice for those types of patients. A patient who has an issue where they're the interpretation of satiety or satiation is impacted in the brain, something like phentermine and topramate phentermine combination may be the right drug. And certainly someone who has an emotional eating, something that's driven by the mesolimbic region of the brain, we think that Contrave, naltrexone bupropion, is likely the right choice to help them with that sort of emotional eating aspect. So his work has really done a lot to help drive and help us understand that we need to start treating obesity different. We need to start using the similar practices for other chronic diseases, such as precision medicine and choosing that right medication as well.
Thank you. So if we think about other treatments, can you tell us why the evolution of treatments, say for hypertension, are perhaps a good model for how the obesity drug landscape will develop also?
Sure. So if you think about antihypertensive therapy, you can go back early to the 1900s where the first therapies were developed, but poorly tolerated. It wasn't until 1950 when diuretics first came on the market for the treatment of hypertension. Then in the 60s, you had calcium channel blockers and beta blockers. And then in the 70s, you had ACE inhibitors and eventually ARBs. So you see this progression of treatment, the evolution of treatment of different classes of drugs to treat hypertension. But it really wasn't until the 70s and early 80s where we started to realize the true benefit of the treatment of control of hypertension. But we also understood that not every patient would be able to tolerate or be able to take certain antihypertensive medications. And for me, it mirrors or is very similar to what we're seeing with anti-obesity medications that we currently have on the market. In the 90s, we had fen-phen that was pulled from the market. Then we didn't have a lot of medications that were available. Qsymia and Contrave became available in the early, around 2010 through 2015. And now we're seeing GLP-1s that were originally, as you said earlier, used for diabetes, but at higher doses are now being used for anti-obesity treatment. And so the progression of what we see with antihypertensive medications is very, very similar to what I'm seeing and what we think will progress in terms of anti-obesity medicines.
Okay, so if we go back to the cost implications, how can the obesity crisis be tackled in a cost-effective way?
Well, that's a great question. And the first step was to understand it as a disease. And obesity and the crisis of obesity did not start yesterday. And we have many medications now that are available. We're just not using them properly. Instead of approaching obesity the way we would approach any chronic progressive disease, diabetes, hypertension, et cetera, we're not prescribing anti-obesity medicines the same way. What I'm seeing and what I'm hearing from many physicians is that they either are not well trained in the treatment of obesity. I always tell the story that many, many, many years ago when I was in medical school, I had more lectures on medical malpractice than I did on obesity. And I had one lecture on medical malpractice. Oh, that's changing. That's changing. It's getting better. But we're also seeing that the training's still inadequate. And when you combine inadequate training with healthcare professionals who are very strapped for time to spend with patients to really understand the underlying cause, they don't make the proper diagnosis or the proper evaluation. Not because they don't want to necessarily, but they don't have the time. Or it could be that they're just uncomfortable. And so the patient will come in frustrated with the treatment of their obesity up until that point and say, look, I heard this drug on social media is the right drug. Ozempic's the right drug for me. Well, first of all, Ozempic's not indicated for obesity. It's only for diabetes. It's a different dose, same molecule. But the physician wants to provide the best treatment for the patient to make sure the patient gets some sort of treatment. And instead of taking the time, they write the prescription. And I think that's a disservice to the patient. It's not meant to cause harm or be anything but the best thing for the patient, but I think we're doing a disservice for the patient.
If we think about that HCP patient relationship, our conversation thus far has been very US centered. I was wondering if you could comment at all upon what we can learn from how European countries have addressed the disease at all.
So that's interesting. And in some ways, I think Europe's a few years ahead of where we're at in the US. Our product's in 49 countries at this point. And so we've been watching very carefully what other European countries have been doing. And I think that one of the better examples, and I can't remember which country for sure, maybe Denmark, for a year had essentially had offered reimbursement for all anti-obesity medications. And when there aren't proper guidelines or guidances for healthcare professionals to address and treat obesity, to diagnose it correctly, patients are coming in and demanding a very specific medication, and they're hearing about the GLP-1s on social media, et cetera, and healthcare professionals are providing that. When the cost of that medicine starts to hit the government in terms of the reimbursement, they realize that two things. It's not sustainable from a cost perspective, excessive cost. But they're also, I think, realizing that some patients either can't tolerate the medicine or are not responding the way they would expect. And so I think it's really important that we take a step back, and I think some countries are starting to do this, and look at what's the underlying cause. Unfortunately, what we're sometimes seeing is that medications are being restricted. They're being restricted based on BMI, being restricted for other reasons in certain countries. And to me, that's completely backwards. We would never look at a patient who was diagnosed with diabetes and say, well, cost is too much to treat the diabetes because your hemoglobin A1C is only 7.2. We're going to wait for treatment until it reaches 7.5, then we'll start you on the treatment. It's unethical. It's really something that we would never do for diabetes or hypertension. You don't wait till someone's blood pressure's systolic blood pressure of 180 before you start treatment. Why do we treat obesity the same way? We shouldn't. We should be looking at early intervention. It's a chronic progressive disease that requires chronic, lifelong treatment, whether that's pharmaceutical, surgical, dietary, exercise, whatever. But early treatment is key and critical. And restricting access to treatment because of cost or until you reach a certain surrogate marker, for example, BMI, is to me just unethical and discriminatory against patients with obesity.
Absolutely. It is making clear that this is a chronic progressive disease, that categorization of it as such. You mentioned there, though, Michael, exercise. We also recently reported on a meta-analysis of 218 randomized clinical trials that was published in the British Medical Journal back in February, which suggested that exercise, whether that be walking, jogging, yoga, or strength training, all of which were found to be the most effective forms of exercise, matched, for example, talking therapies and outperformed antidepressants when it comes to issues related to obesity. And that is what doctors should really be prescribing. So in your opinion, Michael, all things considered with this discussion we've been having today, how do you believe doctors should be talking about obesity with their patients? How should that HCP-patient relationship be nurtured in these overburdened, time-strapped health systems?
Well, first of all, there is no anti-obesity medication on the market that has an indication without lifestyle change of diet and exercise. It is critical that anytime you evaluate or treat a patient with obesity or a patient that's overweight, diet and exercise must be prescribed. That's not my opinion. That's the consensus of the medical community. In terms of dealing with patients with obesity know that they're obese. They live it daily. They live with the discrimination and bias. They've heard all the advice before. They've tried lots of approaches. They want and they need an honest and direct healthcare provider, a partner, someone who's going to collaborate and prescribe a treatment plan that fits their needs. something that has clear, achievable goals, but also has a plan if the prescribed treatment doesn't go the way they want it to go. They don't achieve the goals. And so the healthcare provider needs to be able to partner with the patient and find the solution that's right for them. There's a very wise patient advocate with lived experience of obesity who said, there's no one treatment that works for every patient, but for every patient, there is a treatment that works for them. And I think that's critical, that we have to be able to look at each patient individually, spend the time, be a partner with them. We don't have to be uncomfortable talking about something that the patient already knows. They know they're obese. They know they have an issue. They're looking for answers and solutions. And healthcare providers have to be comfortable talking about that.
Absolutely. So if we think about these answers and solutions, what of the future? What does the horizon look like in a decade's time, say, for all treatments, including preventative measures when it comes to obesity?
Well, I think for me, the key is that treatment of patients who are overweight and in really early obesity need to be treated the same way we treat the other chronic diseases. It's that early intervention that's going to be key and critical. It's a process of arresting or slowing down the progression of the disease. As we spoke before, I see a number of different classes and combination of classes of treatment of anti-obesity medications that will be used in combination with diet and exercise. I see improvements in education, not only for healthcare professionals, but also for patients, and helping them understand, that there are options out there for them, that it's not just what they see or the latest fad or what the latest celebrity is using to lose weight to fit into their tuxedo for the next event. But it's also improvement in terms of diagnosis, finding solutions for healthcare professionals that they can, in a very timely manner, identify the potential underlying cause of the obesity condition so that they can select the right medication for the right patient at the right time. There are lots of good options for patients out there, but you have to make sure that you select the right option for the right patient.
Thank you, Michael. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you very much.
And so that concludes another episode of the pharmaphorum podcast. You can find out more information about this episode, including a download link and information about previous installments of the series at pharmaphorum.com/podcasts. The pharmaphorum podcast is also available on iTunes, Spotify, Acast, Stitcher, and Podbean, where you can find and subscribe by searching for pharmaphorum. Of course, don't forget to visit our website itself, where you can sign up for daily news and analysis bulletins, and follow us on Twitter, or X nowadays, at @pharmaphorum. That's all for now. Thank you for listening.